Julian Blackwood had held many things in his 30 years. The reins of parliamentary debate, the deed to 1,200 acres, the polished confidence of a man raised to command. But he had never held anything the way he held that glove. His mother found him at dawn, still dressed from the night before, hand pressed against his chest as though protecting a wound. And inside his closed fist was a piece of worn kidskin that belonged to a woman he had told her 3 weeks earlier he would forget by Tuesday. The glove was creased at the knuckles from years of work, stained faintly at the fingertips, something that smelled of lavender and camphor. And Julian's grip on it was so tight that when Constance touched his shoulder to wake him, his first instinct was not to open his eyes, but to pull it closer. She did not ask him why he had it, or how long he had been holding it, or what had changed between the Tuesday he had promised and the dawn that found him clutching proof that he had failed. She simply sat on the edge of his bed, looked at her son's face, unguarded in sleep in a way it never was in waking, and understood that the woman whose glove he held had done something no one else in Julian's carefully ordered world had ever managed. She had made him forget himself. The kitchen entrance at Hartwell Park had not been designed for receiving guests of any consequence, which was precisely why Julian Blackwood did not expect to find one there on the second Tuesday of October. He had come down the back stair to speak with the head gardener about the south orchard, and found instead a young woman in a gray wool dress standing at the servant's door with a wicker basket over one arm, and the kind of composure that made her look as though she had been waiting exactly the correct amount of time, not long enough to be inconvenienced, not briefly enough to have just arrived. She was perhaps 27, dark-haired, with a sort of direct gaze that suggested she was accustomed to being listened to and had no particular anxiety about whether she would be. Julian, who had been the Duke of Hartwell since his father's death 4 years earlier, and had developed a reliable instinct for household irregularities, assumed that she was a new housemaid who had mistaken the entrance. "You are new?" he said, not unkindly. "Mrs. Hartley will show you to the servants' hall. The housekeeper's office is through the corridor to the left." The woman looked at him with an expression that was not quite amusement and not quite irritation, but something that occupied the precise midpoint between the two. "I am not new," she said. Her voice was clear, educated, and carried the faint trace of someone who had grown up in the village rather than the estate. "I am Miss Somerton, the apothecary, the same one your tenants have been consulting for 4 years, and the same one your mother has been consulting for 4 months. I have brought the Dowager's tincture, as I do every second Tuesday. If Mrs. Hartley is available, she will know where to direct me, but I am not in need of direction to the servants' hall." Julian felt something shift in the space between them, a small recalibration of assumptions that was not entirely comfortable. He was not accustomed to being corrected, and he was even less accustomed to finding the correction attractive. But there was something in the way Nell Somerton held his gaze, something in the directness of her speech that bypassed every social formula he had been trained to expect, and he felt a flicker of interest that he immediately recognized as inconvenient. "Miss Somerton," he said, inclining his head in a gesture that was part apology and part reassessment. "Forgive me. I was not aware my mother had engaged an apothecary." "Your mother did not engage me," Nell replied. "She consulted me. There is a difference. One implies employment, the other implies trust." She did not wait for his response. She stepped past him into the corridor with a kind of quiet authority that suggested she knew precisely where she was going. And Julian was left standing at the kitchen entrance with the uncomfortable awareness that he had just been gently but decisively put in his place by a woman whose name he had heard in passing, but whose existence he had filed under the general category of village competence, worthy of vague approbation, irrelevant to his own concerns. He told himself, as he returned to the matter of the south orchard, that the encounter was insignificant, a momentary friction, and he would forget her by Tuesday. That evening, Julian sat across from his mother in the Hartwell dining room, where the candles burned in their silver holders and the silence between courses had the particular quality of a conversation waiting to happen. Constance Blackwood, Dowager Duchess of Hartwell, was a woman of 53 who had survived her husband's death, her son's assumption of the title, and 3 decades of country society with a kind of grace that concealed a will of pure iron. She watched her son now, with the expression of someone who had been waiting for him to say something, and was prepared to wait as long as necessary. Julian, who recognized the expression, decided to speak first. "I met Miss Somerton this afternoon," he said, reaching for his wine glass. "At the kitchen entrance. I mistook her for a new housemaid." Constance set down her fork with the deliberate care of someone placing a piece on a chessboard. And how did Miss Somerton respond to being mistaken for a housemaid? She corrected me, Julian said, with considerable composure. She is a woman of considerable composure, Constance replied. She is also a woman of considerable skill. Her father was the finest apothecary this county has seen in 2 generations, and she has inherited both his knowledge and his practice. I have been consulting her since June. Julian looked at his mother, with the faint surprise of someone discovering a room in his own house he had not known existed. For what? Migraines, Constance said smoothly. Dr. Crawford prescribes laudanum. Miss Somerton prescribes valerian and observation. I prefer the latter. Julian accepted this without comment, though something in his mother's tone suggested there was more to the matter than she was saying. He returned his attention to his plate and attempted to dismiss the subject, but Constance was not finished. What did you think of her? She asked. Julian considered the question. He thought of the directness of Nell Somerton's gaze, the precision of her speech, the way she had corrected him without deference or apology. He thought of the flicker of attraction he had felt and immediately categorized as irrelevant, an aesthetic response to competence, nothing more. She is direct, he said finally. Intelligent, admirably self-possessed. Admirable, Constance repeated, as though testing the weight of the word. Yes, I expect that is the word you would choose. There was something in her voice that Julian did not entirely understand. But before he could ask, she continued. Lady Clarissa Beaumont will be joining us for dinner on Thursday, Constance said. Her mother writes that she's eager to see the estate again. I believe she has not visited since the summer. Julian nodded. Lady Clarissa Beaumont was the daughter of the Earl of Ashford, a woman of 28 with impeccable manners, flawless French, and the kind of beauty that looked as though it had been designed by a portrait artist with a commission to paint the ideal aristocratic wife. She was charming, accomplished, and entirely appropriate. Julian had danced with her at 3 county assemblies and escorted her through the Hartwell Gardens on 2 occasions. And everyone, including, he suspected, Clarissa herself, understood that an offer was expected before the end of the season. I look forward to it, Julian said. Constance looked at her son for a long moment, her expression unreadable. And Miss Somerton? She asked. Will you see her again? Julian smiled, the easy, confident smile of a man who had never doubted his own categories. I expect I will see her in the village, he said, but I am not likely to think of her beyond that. I would forget her by Tuesday. Constance lifted her wine glass and held it without drinking, her gaze steady on her son's face. She said quietly, Tuesday, yes. I expect you will. She set the glass down on the mahogany table with a soft, deliberate sound, and Julian, who had been raised to notice the smallest shifts in his mother's tone, he felt the faint prickle of unease that came from knowing he had said something his mother found significant, and he did not yet understand why. But the moment passed. The next course arrived, and Julian dismissed the entire matter as he had dismissed Nell Somerton, efficiently, rationally, and with the certainty that by the following Tuesday, he would have forgotten both the encounter and the unease. He was wrong. The fever arrived in Thornley Village on the 19th of October, carried by a peddler who had stopped at the Keene cottage to sell ribbons and left behind something considerably less decorative. Within a week, 14 children were burning with scarlet fever. And the cottages along the eastern road had become a geography of crisis that smelled of sweat and fear and the particular desperation of parents who did not know whether their children would survive the night. Dr. Edmund Crawford, who had served the county for 23 years and the wealthiest families within it for considerably longer, made his assessments with the brisk efficiency of a man who understood that medicine was a profession, and professionals did not work without compensation. He treated the families who could pay his fee. He prescribed remedies to the families who could promise payment within the month, and he told the rest with genuine regret that he could do nothing for them. Nell Somerton heard about the fever on a Thursday morning when Mary Briggs appeared at her cottage door with her youngest son Thomas in her arms and terror in her eyes. He is burning, Mary said. Dr. Crawford came yesterday and said it was in God's hands. But I thought, Miss Somerton, I thought you might. She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Nell took the child from her arms, felt the heat radiating from his small body, and made the same calculation she had been making since her father's death 4 years earlier. The calculation between what was right and what was sustainable, between the medicine she could afford to give and the debts she could afford to accumulate. She chose the child. She always chose the child. Bring him inside, Nell said. Now, I will need you to describe when the fever started and whether he has been able to keep water down. By the end of the week, Nell was moving between cottages with her father's medical case and a diminishing supply of willow bark, feverfew, and camphor, ingredients her father had purchased on credit from Mr. Enderby in Bath years earlier, and which Nell had been paying down at 3 shillings a week ever since. She worked alone. She did not ask for help because help required coordination, and coordination required time, and time was the one thing the children burning in those cottages did not have. The village watched. The tenants who could not pay Dr. Crawford brought their children to the apothecary's daughter and paid her in eggs, firewood, and the kind of gratitude that could not be deposited at Mr. Enderby's shop. The tenants who could pay Dr. Crawford watched Nell Somerton move between cottages at all hours and wondered, privately, whether competence and compassion might be worth more than credentials. And Julian Blackwood, who received a report from his estate steward on the 26th of October detailing the scope of the outbreak and the likelihood of further contagion, made a decision that he told himself was entirely rational and had nothing whatsoever to do with a woman he had promised to forget by Tuesday. He opened the east wing of Hartwell Park as a makeshift ward. Send word to the village, Julian told his steward. Any family with a child suffering from the fever may bring them to the estate. Mrs. Hartley will prepare the east wing. I want beds, linens, and water available by this evening. The steward, a man named Peters who had served Julian's father and understood the economics of estate management, hesitated. Your Grace, he said carefully, Dr. Crawford has indicated that the fever is most dangerous to those in close quarters. Opening the estate to the tenants may risk the household staff. Then the household staff may take precautions, Julian replied. But the children will not be left to burn in cottages without adequate care. Send the message, Peters. Peters sent the message. And by nightfall, the first families had begun arriving at Hartwell's east entrance, carrying children wrapped in blankets and the kind of hope that comes from knowing that a duke's house is cleaner, warmer, and better supplied than anything they could provide in their own homes. Nell Somerton arrived an hour later with her father's medical case and no invitation whatsoever. She walked past the footman at the east door, past Mrs. Hartley in the corridor, and directly into the largest of the prepared rooms, where she set down her case, removed her gloves, and began issuing instructions to the household staff, with the calm authority of someone who had been managing crises since she was old enough to compound a tincture. I will need boiled water in each room, she said to Mrs. Hartley. Clean linens changed every 4 hours. The windows should remain open regardless of the temperature. The air must move. And I will need someone to take note of which children are keeping water down and which are not. Can you read and write? Mrs. Hartley, who had been the Hartwell housekeeper for 16 years and was not accustomed to taking orders from anyone other than the Duke or the Dowager, looked at Nell Somerton with an expression that might have been offense and might have been respect. I can read and write, Miss Somerton, she said. Good, Nell replied. Then you will keep the log. I will check it every 2 hours. She turned to the nearest bed, where a child of perhaps 5 lay shivering beneath a blanket, and knelt beside him with a kind of focused attention that made everything else in the room irrelevant. Julian, who had been standing in the corridor outside and had heard every word of the exchange, felt the same flicker of interest he had felt at the kitchen entrance 3 weeks earlier. Only now, it was not a flicker. It was something considerably more difficult to dismiss. He told himself it was admiration. He told himself it was the rational appreciation of competence in action. He told himself that what he felt watching Nell Somerton take command of his household without asking permission was no different from what he felt watching a well-managed parliamentary debate or a perfectly executed military maneuver. He told himself all of this because the alternative, that what he felt was attraction, and that attraction was pulling him toward a woman who occupied a category his entire education had taught him to admire from a distance, was not something his philosophy permitted him to consider. So he called it admiration. And he walked the east corridor 4 times that day, listening for her voice through the doors, and told himself he was simply ensuring that his household was being managed appropriately. The village, watching the Duke of Hartwell carry water to the east wing and follow the apothecary's daughter's instructions without question, was not convinced. Lady Clarissa Beaumont, who heard about the arrangement from her mother's housekeeper and visited Hartwell on the 3rd day of the outbreak, was even less convinced. She found Julian in the corridor outside the ward, sleeves rolled to his elbows and a basin of water in his hands, and looked at him with the kind of carefully modulated concern that suggested she had rehearsed the expression before arriving. Julian, she said, her voice soft with worry. Should you be doing this? Surely the staff are occupied, Julian said. and the work needs doing. Clarissa glanced toward the open door of the ward, where Nell's voice could be heard giving quiet instructions to a mother about how to position her child to ease his breathing. Miss Somerton seems very capable, Clarissa said. She's the most capable apothecary within 40 miles, Julian replied. Clarissa smiled, a small, precise smile that did not reach her eyes. How fortunate for the village, she said. She stayed for 20 minutes, offered help that required supervision, and left with the kind of gracious sympathy that looked perfect and accomplished nothing. Nell, who had been in the ward for 16 hours and had not stopped moving, did not notice Clarissa's visit. She noticed only that the Duke of Hartwell had carried water without being asked, and that his hands were steady when he held a child so she could check for the rash, and that when she told him to open the windows wider, he did so without question. She did not know what to make of a duke who followed her instructions. So she focused on the children and told herself that his presence was a logistical convenience, and tried very hard not to notice the way he watched her when he thought she was not looking. Nell moved her entire operation into Hartwell on the 4th day of the outbreak, when it became clear that traveling between the estate and the village was costing her more time than she could afford. She set up her workspace in the small library adjacent to the east wing, where she could compound tinctures and prepare poultices without leaving the children unattended for more than a few minutes at a time. Julian opened the room to her without comment, and Mrs. Hartley provided a workbench, a spirit lamp, and access to the household stores of vinegar, salt, and honey. The arrangement was temporary, practical, and entirely rational. It was also the most intimate proximity Julian had ever maintained with a woman who was not a member of his family. And he was beginning to understand that rationality and intimacy were not mutually exclusive categories. He found reasons to walk the east corridor. He told himself he was monitoring the situation. He told himself he was ensuring that the household resources were being appropriately deployed. But the truth, which he did not admit even to himself, was that he was listening for Nell's voice, and that when he heard it, something in his chest eased in a way that had nothing to do with estate management. He carried water. He held children while Nell checked their pulses. He followed her instructions with a kind of obedience he had never shown anyone, and when Mrs. Hartley remarked to the under-housekeeper that the Duke of Hartwell was taking orders from a village apothecary, the under-housekeeper replied that perhaps the Duke had finally met someone worth taking orders from. The household staff noticed. They noticed that His Grace waited outside the library door until Miss Somerton emerged. They noticed that he carried her case when she moved between rooms. They noticed that when she spoke, he listened with the kind of attention he usually reserved for parliamentary briefs, and that when she corrected him, which she did frequently and without apology, he did not bristle. He learned. Clarissa visited again on the 7th day and offered to read to the children. Nell thanked her and handed her a primer, and Clarissa spent 40 minutes reading in a clear, pleasant voice that required no effort and produced no particular result. When she left, Nell returned to the bedside of a child who was struggling to breathe and did not look up until the crisis had passed. Julian, who had watched both women work, understood for the first time that there was a difference between help that looked gracious and help that saved lives, and that the difference was the same as the difference between admiration and necessity. He still called what he felt admiration, but the category was beginning to fracture. The fever intensified on the 9th night, when the east wing became a place where time moved differently, measured not in hours, but in breaths, not in days, but in the increments of a child's temperature rising or falling beneath a cloth soaked in vinegar and water. Nell had not slept for more than an hour at a time in a week. And Julian had stopped pretending he had any responsibilities more important than being present when she needed another pair of hands. It was during this night that the first true intimacy between them occurred, not a conversation, not a glance, but a moment of physical necessity that bypassed every social boundary Julian had been raised to maintain. Nell was in the center of the ward, kneeling beside a boy of perhaps 7 whose convulsions had started an hour earlier and showed no sign of stopping. His mother stood against the wall, the hands pressed to her mouth, and Nell's voice was calm and steady as she called across the room. "Your Grace," she said. And Julian, who had been standing in the doorway, crossed to her side without hesitation. "I need you to hold him," Nell said. Both hands on his shoulders. Firm pressure, but not forceful. He needs to feel contained, not restrained. Julian knelt and placed his hands where she indicated, and for the first time in his life, he felt the full weight of another person's survival resting directly against his palms. The boy's skin was burning. His small body shook with a violence that seemed impossible for something so fragile to contain. And Nell's hands moved over him with absolute certainty, checking his pulse, adjusting his position, murmuring instructions that Julian followed without thought. Support his neck. Yes, he'd like that. Do not let go. He did not let go. He held the boy for 20 minutes while Nell worked, and when the convulsions finally eased and the child's breathing steadied, Julian realized that his hands were shaking and Nell's were not. She looked at him across the body of the sleeping child, and something passed between them that had no name and no category. A recognition that they had just held a life together, and that the holding had required both of them, and that neither of them had been sufficient alone. "Thank you," she said quietly. Julian nodded. He did not trust himself to speak. He stood, and his hands felt strange and empty, without the weight of the child against them. And he understood that something had shifted in a way that could not be shifted back. Over the next 3 nights, the physical intimacy between them built through crisis in ways that felt both necessary and inevitable. Nell grabbed his wrist to steady her hand when exhaustion made her fingers tremble, and Julian wrapped his hand around hers from behind, his thumb finding her pulse, his strength serving her precision. He draped his coat over her shoulders when she walked between the ward and the cottage in the rain, and she wore it until morning, too tired to remove it. And when she finally returned it, the wool smelled of lavender and camphor, and something else that Julian could not name but recognized as hers. He told himself it was alliance. He told himself it was the intimacy of shared purpose. He told himself that what his body had already decided, that Nell Somerton was necessary, and that her presence had become the axis around which his days turned, was simply the rational response to competence under pressure. But on the 12th night, when Thomas Briggs's fever spiked and Nell's face went white with fear, Julian stopped telling himself anything at all. He simply stayed. Thomas Briggs was 6 years old, the youngest of 4 children, and the fever that had touched him lightly at first turned vicious on the 12th night, with a kind of speed that left no time for philosophy or category. Dr. Edmund Crawford, summoned by Mary Briggs in desperation, examined the boy and delivered his assessment with the tone of a man who had seen this before and knew how it ended. "The fever is in God's hands now," Crawford said. "I can do nothing more." Nell, standing in the doorway of the sick room, heard the pronouncement and felt something cold and final settle in her chest. She waited until Crawford had left, until Mary Briggs had collapsed into a chair with her face in her hands. And then she crossed to the bed and placed her hand on Thomas's forehead. He was burning. His pulse was rapid and thready. His breathing was shallow. And Nell, who had learned medicine from a father who believed that God's hands worked through human hands and that surrender was not the same as faithfulness, made a decision. "I am taking over," she said. Mary looked up, her face streaked with tears. "Miss Somerton, Dr. Crawford said—" "Dr. Crawford said he could do nothing more," Nell interrupted. "I did not say that. I need you to bring me cold water, clean cloths, and the willow bark tincture from my case. And I need you to trust me." Mary Briggs, last who had known Nell since she was a girl learning her father's trade, nodded and stood. Julian, who had been standing in the corridor and had heard every word, entered the room. "What do you need?" he asked. Nell looked at him, and for the first time since the outbreak began, he saw fear in her eyes. Not the manageable concern of a professional assessing risk, but the raw, unguarded terror of someone who understood that she was about to attempt something that might fail, and that failure would mean a child's death. "I need you to stay," she said. "I need you to follow every instruction I give without question, without hesitation, and without leaving this room until I tell you it is safe to leave. Can you do that?" He said yes. And so he stayed. For 6 hours, the Duke of Hartwell followed the instructions of a village apothecary as though his life depended on it, because a child's life did. He supported Thomas's neck while Nell poured tincture between his lips. He changed the cold compresses on the boy's forehead every 10 minutes. He held the basin while Nell worked, and when she told him to describe the changes in Thomas's breathing, he did so with the precision of someone who understood that observation was not passive, but active, and that the smallest detail might be the one that saved a life. At midnight, Thomas's fever spiked again, and Nell's hands began to shake, not from fear, but from exhaustion, from the cumulative weight of 12 days without sleep and the knowledge that she had nothing left to give except her presence and her will. Julian saw the tremor in her hands and acted without thought. He stepped behind her, wrapped his hand around her wrist, and steadied the tremor so she could pour the next dose of tincture without spilling it. His hand was warm. His grip was firm. And his thumb, resting against the inside of her wrist, found her pulse and held it as though he were counting her heartbeats, as though he needed to know that she was still there, still breathing, still fighting. "Tell me when the breathing changes," Nell said, her voice barely audible. He replied, "I will." At 3 a.m, Thomas's fever broke. The change was sudden. One moment the boy was burning, the next his skin was cool and damp, and his breathing eased into the deep, steady rhythm of sleep. Nell placed her hand on his chest, felt the rise and fall, and closed her eyes. She said quietly, "He will live." Mary Briggs, who had been sitting in the corner with her hands folded in prayer, began to weep. Julian, who had not released Nell's wrist, felt her pulse slow beneath his thumb and understood that the crisis was over and that he was still holding her. He let go. She stepped away, and neither of them spoke. At dawn, Nell walked to the library and sat in the chair by the window. She did not intend to sleep. She intended to rest for 10 minutes and then return to the ward. But exhaustion overtook intention, and within moments she was asleep, her head tipped back against the chair, one hand resting in her lap. The other hand, still gloved, slipped from the armrest and fell to the floor. Julian, who had followed her to the library to ask whether she needed anything, saw the glove fall. He crossed the room, picked it up, and stood holding it in the gray light of early morning. It was kid skin, worn at the fingertips from years of work. It smelled faintly of lavender and camphor. The stitching along the thumb was frayed. And Julian, who had held many things in his life, but had never held anything with the kind of tenderness that came from understanding that an object could carry the weight of a person, put the glove in his coat pocket and left the room without waking her. 3 days later, Constance entered her son's rooms at dawn to ask him a question about the household accounts and found him asleep on the bed, still dressed from the night before. One hand pressed against his chest as though protecting something. She crossed to the bed and looked down at him. His face, unguarded in sleep, he held an expression she had never seen in his waking life. Something soft and undefended and achingly vulnerable. His fist was closed, and inside it, visible between his fingers, was a piece of worn kid skin. Constance sat on the edge of the bed and did not wake him. She simply watched her son hold the glove of a woman he had promised to forget. And she understood that Tuesday had passed, and that forgetting was no longer possible, and that the real question was not whether Julian loved Nell Somerton, but whether he would allow himself to understand that love and admiration were not the same thing. She stood, crossed to the nightstand, and wrote a single line on a piece of paper. "Tuesday has passed, Julian." She left the note where he would find it and closed the door behind her. Constance did not speak to her son about the glove immediately. She waited. She watched. And on the 16th day after the outbreak began, when the last of the children had been declared well enough to return home, and Nell Somerton had packed her father's medical case and prepared to leave Hartwell, Constance invited her son to tea in the drawing room and told him the truth. "I have been visiting Miss Somerton for 4 months," Constance said without preamble. "Not for migraines. For this." She held out her right hand. The tremor was faint but visible, a small persistent shaking that worsened when she tried to hold the hand steady. Julian, who had been reaching for his teacup, froze. He said, "Mother." "It began in June," Constance continued. "A tremor in my hands. Episodes of weakness that leave me unable to hold a pen or lift a cup without assistance. Dr. Crawford would have reported it to you immediately, and you would have taken over the management of my household in the name of care. I would have lost the independence I have maintained since your father's death. So I consulted Miss Somerton instead." Julian's face had gone pale. "Why did you not tell me?" "Because you would have solved it," Constance said. "You would have brought in specialists from London, restructured my household, assigned a companion to monitor my condition, and treated my dignity as a problem to be managed rather than a right to be preserved." Miss Somerton did none of those things. She observed. She prescribed valerian and careful monitoring. She visited every second Tuesday, and treated me with more skill than Crawford has shown in 11 years, and told no one. She has kept my dignity intact for 4 months, Julian. And you told me you would forget her by Tuesday." Julian set down his cup. His hands were shaking. He said, "I did not know. You did not ask. Constance said, and her voice was not unkind, but it was unrelenting. You called her admirable. You called her capable. You called her the best apothecary within 40 miles, and every one of those words was true. But do you know what admirable means to a woman like her, Julian? It means excellent, but not for me. It is what men say about women they respect enough to praise and not enough to choose. Your father used the same word about good horses. You use it about good people. The distance is the same. Julian looked at his mother. And for the first time in his adult life, he had no response. Because she was right. He had called Nell admirable. He had meant it as a compliment. And he had never once considered that the compliment was designed to keep her safely in a category where admiration did not require him to reconsider anything about the world he had been raised in. I never said she was beneath me, he said quietly. You never said she was equal, Constance replied. The omission is the statement, Julian. You have spent 3 weeks holding her glove in your sleep and calling what you feel admiration because your philosophy has no other word for it. But your body has already decided. The question is whether you will allow your mind to catch up, or whether you will continue to file the most important person in your life under a heading designed to keep her at a distance. She stood, smoothed her skirts, and looked at her son with the kind of steady, unblinking gaze that had governed his childhood, and still, occasionally, governed his conscience. Tuesday has passed, she said. Several Tuesdays have passed. The glove is still in your coat, and the woman who wore it is leaving Hartwell this afternoon. What you do with that information is your decision. But I will not watch you dismiss her again. She left the room, and Julian sat alone in the drawing room with his mother's words ringing in his ears, and the glove, still in his coat pocket, still carried everywhere he went, pressing against his chest like an accusation. The county assembly dinner took place on the first Saturday of November, and it was the kind of event that brought together tenants and gentry in a performance of shared community that lasted exactly as long as the meal and dissolved the moment the dancing began. Lady Clarissa Beaumont attended on her mother's arm, dressed in pale blue silk that made her look like a porcelain figure. And she smiled at Julian across the room with a kind of certainty that suggested she expected the evening to end with an understanding. Nell Somerton attended because Mrs. Briggs had insisted, because the vicar's wife had personally delivered the invitation, and because refusing would have suggested she was ashamed of her work, which she was not. She wore a gray dress that was well made but plain. When she sat at the far end of the tenant table with her hands folded in her lap, and the quiet dignity of someone who knew exactly how much she was worth, and did not require external validation to confirm it, Clarissa noticed her immediately. And Clarissa, who had spent the past month hearing about the apothecary's daughter from every servant and tenant in the county, decided that the time had come to clarify the social order. She waited until the second course, when the room was full and the conversation loud enough to provide cover. And then she leaned toward the woman seated beside her, Mrs. Penrose, the wife of a neighboring landowner, and spoke in a voice that was just loud enough to carry. How charming that Miss Somerton attends on the Dowager Duchess, Clarissa said. One does wonder what a village herbalist prescribes that doctor. Crawford cannot. Perhaps the remedies are more conversational than medicinal. The insinuation landed with the precision of a knife between ribs. Mrs. Penrose laughed. A small, uncertain sound that suggested she was not entirely sure whether she was supposed to find the comment amusing or offensive. But the laughter was enough. The women nearby heard it. The suggestion spread. Nell, sitting at the far end of the room, did not hear the comment. But Mrs. Briggs, who was serving the tenant table, heard every word. And Mrs. Briggs, who had watched Nell sit with her son for 6 hours while the Duke of Hartwell followed her instructions, felt something cold and furious settle in her chest. Julian, seated at the head of the gentry table, who heard the laughter and looked up in time to see Clarissa's smile, the small, satisfied smile of someone who had just accomplished something she believed to be clever. He stood. The room quieted, not because he had called for silence, but because the Duke of Hartwell did not stand in the middle of a meal unless something significant was about to happen. Julian walked past Clarissa without looking at her. He walked to the center of the room, where the space between the gentry table and the tenant table formed a kind of neutral ground, and he stopped. This county knows Miss Nell Somerton, he said. His voice was calm, clear, and carried to every corner of the room. Many of you have been treated by her. Your children have been treated by her. What this county does not know is that her father, Samuel Somerton, who served this village for 22 years and was never formally compensated. He purchased medicines on credit for families who could not pay. His daughter inherited his practice and his debts. She has been paying them down at 3 shillings a week for 4 years. He paused. The room was absolutely silent. Miss Somerton's father treated your families, Julian continued, looking directly at the tenant table. The Keens, the Briggs, the Wainwrights, the Carters, this estate's tenants, my tenants, and neither my father nor I thought to ask who was keeping them well. He opened a leather folder and held it up. The retainer Mr. Samuel Somerton should have received has been formalized. Backdated 11 years and signed, the outstanding debt to Mr. Enderby of Bath has been settled from the estate account. Miss Somerton's father's botanical drawings, used by 3 London physicians and currently held in collections across England, will carry his name in every catalogue that lists them. He closed the folder and set it on the table. I told my mother I would forget Miss Somerton by Tuesday, Julian said. I was wrong. But being wrong about forgetting her is not the admission that matters. The admission that matters is that. He turned to face the room, and his gaze swept across the gentry table, across Clarissa's pale, shocked face, and came to rest on Nell. I called her admirable, he said. I called her capable. I called her the best apothecary within 40 miles. And every one of those words was designed to keep her safely in a category where admiration does not require me to reconsider anything about the world I was raised in. I was raised to believe that some people are worthy of praise and other people are worthy of equality, and that the 2 categories are distinct. I was wrong, and I am reconsidering. He sat down. What followed was not the hush of shock, but the quiet of a room reorganizing itself around a new center of gravity. And then Mrs. Briggs, standing at the edge of the tenant table with a serving tray in her hands, spoke. Miss Somerton sat with my boy for 6 hours, she said. Her voice was steady and loud enough to carry. She did not sleep. She did not ask for payment. She saved his life. The vicar's wife stood. Samuel Somerton delivered my 3 children, she said. He never sent a bill. I paid him in preserves and mending. It was never enough. William Keene, a tenant farmer of 50, rose from his seat. Sam Somerton set my arm in 98, he said. I paid him in apples. He told me it was sufficient. It was not. One by one, the tenants stood, and one by one, they spoke. Not about Nell's skill, though they mentioned it, but about her father's service, about the debts that had never been paid, about the years of care that had been given freely and never acknowledged. Clarissa watched the room transform around a woman in a gray dress, and she understood, with the cold clarity of someone who had just lost a game she had not realized she was playing, that she had been outclassed. She stood, murmured something to her mother about a headache, and left. Nell sat very still. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her eyes were bright, but her spine was straight. And when Julian finally looked at her across the room, she met his gaze and held it. He did not approach her. He had said what cost him. What happened next was hers to decide. Nell left the assembly an hour later, when the dancing had begun and the room had reorganized itself into the familiar patterns of gentry and tenants, occupying the same space, but not the same world. She walked alone, as she always did, along the lane that led from the assembly rooms to her cottage, and she did not look back. Julian followed at a distance, keeping far enough behind that she would not feel pursued, but close enough that he could see her in the moonlight. He had no plan. He had no speech prepared. He knew only that he could not let her walk home alone, and that if she told him to leave, he would leave, but that he had to try. She stopped in the lane, halfway between the assembly rooms and her cottage, and turned. "You're following me?" she said. He said, "Yes." "Why?" "Because I did not say everything I needed to say." Nell looked at him, and in the moonlight, her face was unreadable. "You said a great deal," she said. "You acknowledged a debt. You named a wrong. You told an entire room that you were reconsidering your philosophy, but you did not say you loved me." Julian took a step closer. He said, "No, I did not." "Why?" "Because the assembly was not for you," he said. "It was for your father, for the tenants, and for a debt my family should have paid years ago. If I had said I loved you in that room, every person present would have heard a duke claiming a village woman after making a generous speech. Charity followed by acquisition. I will not make loving you look like the final act of condescension." Nell's breath caught. She had not expected honesty. She had expected another category, another carefully chosen word designed to keep her at a distance. But this was something else. "Then say it here," she said. where no one can hear it except me. Julian closed the distance between them until he was standing close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "I love you," he said. "Not because you are admirable, though you are. Not because you are capable, though you are. I love you because you corrected me in a corridor, and I have not recovered. Because you held a dying child with steady hands while mine shook. Because I carried your glove for 3 weeks. My hand knew what my philosophy would not permit. I love you. And the word admirable will never be sufficient again," Nell said quietly. "That is better than admirable." "What is it?" She said, "Honest. It is honest." She reached up, gripped the lapels of his coat, and pulled him down to her level. The kiss happened in the lane between the assembly rooms and her cottage, in the borderline geography that belonged to neither his world nor hers, and Nell did not rise to meet him. She brought him down. The geometry held. When they finally pulled apart, Julian rested his forehead against hers and closed his eyes. "I do not know how to do this," he said. "I do not know how to love you in a way that does not look like possession." "Then we will learn together," Nell replied. "Slowly, thoroughly. There is a difference." December arrived with frost on the windows of Hartwell Park, and the kind of cold that made the fires burn brighter and the evenings longer. Constance and Julian sat at dinner in the same room where, 2 months earlier, Julian had promised to forget Nell Somerton by Tuesday. The candles burned in their silver holders. The quiet between them was comfortable. "What did you think of Miss Somerton today?" Constance asked. Julian set down his glass and smiled. Not the practiced social smile he used in public, but something unrehearsed and genuine. "She told me my Latin pronunciation is lazy," he said. "She corrected my understanding of comfrey, and she permitted me to carry her case on the walk to the village, which I'm told constitutes considerable progress." "And will you forget her?" Constance asked. Julian looked at his mother, and the echo of the earlier conversation hung in the air between them like a question that had finally been answered. "I have not forgotten her since the first Tuesday," he said. On the table between them, placed on the linen like a piece of the setting, was the worn kid-skin glove, not hidden in a coat pocket, not carried in secret, placed where it belonged. Constance reached out and touched it, her fingers trembling slightly with a tremor that Nell managed and that no one else knew about. "She's coming for dinner on Thursday," Julian said. "At the kitchen door?" Constance asked. "At the front door," Julian replied. "I have been thinking about doors, Mother. Which ones I use. Which ones I expect other people to use. I am revising." Constance smiled. She said, "Good. It is about time." Spring came to Thornley with a kind of light that made everything look new, and Nell Somerton sat at her workbench in the cottage her father had left her, working on a foxglove illustration that required the precision her father had taught her and the patience she had learned on her own. Each stamen was counted. Each petal was rendered with absolute accuracy. At the bottom of the page, in her careful script, she wrote, "Illustrated by N. Somerton, Thornley." Julian arrived in the afternoon, as he had arrived every afternoon for 3 months. He sat on the stool that was too small for a duke and watched her work with the kind of attention that suggested he had nowhere else he would rather be. "Mr. Enderby sends his regards," Julian said. "He says you are underdosing the children's willow bark." "Mr. Enderby is a pharmacist, not a clinician," Nell replied without looking up. "I told him you would say that." She set down her brush and looked at him. "Your mother's tremor is improving," she said, "because of you." "Because of valerian and regular sleep," Nell said. "I merely deliver them." "You merely deliver everything," Julian said. "The medicine, the honesty, the correction, the unrelenting insistence that I look at what is in front of me instead of what I was taught to see." Nell stood and crossed to where he sat. She took his hand, the hand that had held her glove, the hand that had held Thomas Briggs, the hand that had signed a retainer his father should have written. She held it without gloves, bare hand to bare hand, the first time without kidskin between them. "You are learning," she said. He replied, "Slowly, thoroughly," Nell said. "There is a difference." On the shelf behind her, 2 pairs of gloves sat side by side, the worn pair she had been using for years, these stained at the fingertips with the evidence of her work. And a new pair, fine kid skin, a gift from Julian, given without reason or occasion, given simply because he wanted to give it. She wore the old ones to work. She kept the new ones on the shelf beside her father's case. The first gift given without transaction. The first gift that was not medicine or payment or obligation. The first gift that was simply a gift. The cottage held them. The door was open. The lane outside led to Hartwell in one direction and the village in the other, and they sat in the middle where the border was, where the categories dissolved, where a duke on a stool too small and an apothecary with herb-stained hands were learning, slowly, thoroughly, that the distance between admiration and love was the distance between a closed door and an open one, from everything beginning.